there were two reasons why I was on the side of Remain in the EU back in 2016. One was pure personal loyalty to friends. David Cameron was Prime Minister, George Osborne was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and they are friends of mine. And I felt obliged as a friend to support them when they decided to stick with the EU and not to recommend Brexit.
Did that friendship supersede what your feelings were, or was that because you really trusted that they could get it done right?
Well, there was a second reason that swung it.
Okay.
And I think the reason that I was willing to get on board with Remain was that I found the arguments of the Brexiteers deeply unconvincing. I remember one night sitting down and reading a lot of stuff by Daniel Hannan, one of the leading advocates of leaving. And I remember thinking that this was just intellectually completely third class and unconvincing. The notion that Britain would be better off economically outside the European Union wouldn't have passed muster as an undergraduate paper, never mind a graduate paper. So I felt that the Brexiteers' case failed intellectually because they were claiming, implausibly I thought, that you could have a free lunch, that you could leave the European Union and be better off. Mm-hmm. And that just seemed to me to be intellectually completely deceitful. I think it would have been harder for me if they had said, honestly, this is going to cost quite a bit, but it's worth it. Mm-hmm. Because if we leave, then we shall have the ability to control our borders, and we shall have autonomy at a time when Europe is pursuing a federalist course. But that wasn't the argument. The argument
was that not the argument? Because that was the argument that I could hear
was we were going to get the money.
Uh-huh.
This was the argument. Yeah. We're going to get the money that we give to the European Union, and we're going to be able to spend it on the National Health Service because we will be, in fact, better off. And that was a lie. Mm-hmm. And I'm not good with lies. It was a clever lie. It worked politically. And I give credit to Dominic Cummings for crafting a message that was appealing both to Conservatives and to Labour voters. The Conservatives got immigration control, and Labour voters got the National Health Service gets the money. So this was brilliant politically, but it was mendacious, I think, at heart. And so I opposed the Brexit. When it happened, what struck me in the subsequent months was that while I had been on the side that lost, there was a good reason why we lost. And the good reason was that we went around saying how much it was going to cost. And I think we were right about that. I think ultimately, at least some of what the Treasury said will turn out to be true about the cost. But that wasn't what people cared about. Mm-hmm. And when you went into pubs, as I did in Wales and in England and in Scotland, there was a question to which you could not give an honest answer without losing the debate. And I'll tell you what that question was, because I was asked it multiple times. You'd make the case about the cost. Nobody was interested in the cost. They would say, listen, Neil, about the 1.3 million Muslims the Germans have just let in to Germany, because that had just happened. Mm-hmm. If the Germans give them German passports, can they come here? And the only honest answer to that question was yes. So immigration was the issue. And I think for a significant number of people, in England and Wales especially, it was less so in Scotland where Brexit was defeated, the realization was that Britain had lost control of immigration. Mm-hmm. The people had been promised net migration in the tens of thousands in the 1990s under the Blair government, and they'd ended up with net migration in the hundreds of thousands. They saw the chaos in Germany. They saw the waves of migration coming not only from Syria but from all over North Africa and even South Asia. And they said, and I remember David Cameron using this phrase, "Get me out of here." Mm-hmm. And that was the driving motivation for the Brexit vote, and I think it was legitimate. Because I think that Angela Merkel had made a catastrophic mistake in throwing open the gates. I think it will have dire consequences for the future of Germany and of Europe. And I do not blame British voters for saying, forget about the cost of Brexit. We really need to get out of this. So I took the view by the end of 2016 that you had to respect the fact that ordinary people had cut through the crap of the debate and had got to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter wasn't the cost of Brexit, which is what I had, I think, mistakenly focused on prior to the referendum.
What was it like for you as a public person and, you know, someone that writes about this stuff and puts your opinions out there to have that realization?
I think it's very important, if you write regularly, if you are what we call a public intellectual, to be willing to admit that you've been wrong. I think you have to be prepared to say, I was wrong. And I think I was wrong in the sense that what I wish I had done, looking back, was I wish I had said to David Cameron and George Osborne in the spring of 2016, when it was clear that the Europeans were going to make no meaningful concession on the immigration issue, when they basically sent an insulting proposal about what could be done about migration. That was the moment I should have said to Cameron and Osborne, forget it.
Yeah.
You should campaign for Brexit. If that's all they're going to offer you, if they're so completely oblivious to the very real concerns about immigration, then you should campaign for Brexit. Instead of which we stuck with it. And that was David Cameron's great mistake. He should have said at that moment, if that's all you've got, I'm going to recommend Brexit to the voters. And it would have saved him too. So
you think it was just a bad negotiating ploy, that he just didn't use some leverage to say, we're going to have to walk away from this?
There was a moment when he should have walked away, and I should have advised him to walk away. So yeah, I think one has to recognize when one's made a mistake with such consequences. The second thing which is worth knowing about this is that the people who then inherited power after the fall of Cameron and Osborne were not the people who had campaigned for and won on Brexit. It was people who'd been on the Remain side. Theresa May became Prime Minister. I always knew that would be a disaster. I did not have high regard for her prior to the referendum. The Daily Mail essentially put her in that position, and also Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and others, because they bungled the leadership contest. So we then ended up with a terrible combination, which was a commitment to Brexit, but its execution in the hands of people who had been Remainers. And I think the result is the worst of both worlds, because right now we essentially have the psychological reality of Brexit. I think the British public, to a large extent, has accepted that we are leaving, but the execution's a total mess.
Yeah.
By invoking Article 50 early on, the UK essentially ceded the power in the divorce to the European Union, and the concessions have come one after another ever since then. And we now find ourselves in the odd predicament that I think Theresa May is saying, that Brexit means you cease to be a voting member of the European Union, but you remain within the customs union, potentially even within the single market, and you accept all the rules and regulations of the European Union. You just don't have any power. If that's the end game, then it's a disaster.
So the people that are trying to stop this now, they want to invoke some pretty crazy extreme stuff, right? I mean, there would be some really very rarely, if ever, used rules. Am I right about this? That would actually allow the stay to occur?
Well, listen, I think there's going to
without getting into all of the minutiae of everything.
There is a level of complexity in the discussions now in London that is bewildering to most ordinary British people. When people start talking about Max FAC and the customs union and the complexity
well, that's
of the
why
Irish
I asked it in
border.
such a confusing way, because I discussed it with Douglas Murray and he was even a little confused. So.
It's actually not confusing in the sense that what is happening is that Theresa May is trying to get Britain to accept the realities of belonging to the European Customs Union, which would preclude Britain having its own trade policy, with our leaving the European Union's decision-making body. So essentially, in that version, Brexit is just, you have the responsibilities, you just don't have any power anymore, which is definitely not what the British public was told that it was getting in Brexit. The bigger problem in my mind is not one that we've discussed, and that is that all of this will end in tears to the point at which Jeremy Corbyn, the most left-wing leader the Labour Party has ever had in its history, becomes Prime Minister. Because Theresa May is leading the country towards this very unhappy compromise, at some point, the people who truly believe in Brexit, Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, perhaps Michael Gove, they may decide, well, we can't ultimately accept this, and the government may fall. But the problem is that if the government falls, then Jeremy Corbyn is Prime Minister. If the government doesn't fall, and we go all the way to the finishing line with this Theresa May version of Brexit, then I think the Conservatives will lose the next election in 2022, and Jeremy Corbyn will be Prime Minister. So the worst thing about Brexit is, in my view, that if it is bungled in this way, it will open the door to a truly leftist government. And that will be far more economically damaging than anything Brexit has done. And that's the nightmare scenario for me.
And probably socially damaging, and for
Deeply.
a zillion other reasons.
Deeply.
That you care about.
We should be extremely suspicious of Corbyn and his people. They are committed Marxists. They've been on the wrong side of every issue in my lifetime, with a possible exception of South African apartheid. And I do not trust them with the keys to 10 Downing Street, because I think that their ultimate agenda is a truly revolutionary one. And it poses a threat to the fundamental liberties, the traditions of the Constitution. It's a dangerous, dangerous prospect. And I'm much more worried about Corbyn than about Brexit.
I mean, this is how I feel about what's happening with our left in America, too,
Right.
that you guys are giving us basically the precursor to this.
I think one of the lessons of history, and now we can bring history in, is that with populism you get two flavors. In a typical backlash that would come after a financial crisis, the political establishment's discredited. There's a backlash against inequality, all of the things that typically follow a financial crisis. But there are two possibilities. There's the populism of the left, which is the tax the rich solution. But the populism of the right is more potent, because it says it's about immigration, it's about globalization, it's about free trade. And so, broadly speaking, and there's a very good study that shows this, after big financial crises, the populists of the right do better, because they offer a more plausible story. But if they don't deliver, and they generally don't, because it's quite hard to make immigration control and tariffs pay, it's quite hard actually to make your constituents better off with those policies, then the pendulum has a tendency to swing to the populism of the left. And that has happened in Britain really quickly, because Corbyn became popular very soon after Brexit. It's slower here, but the fear must be that if the Trump experiment goes as wrong as the vast majority of intellectuals expect it to, the pendulum will swing to the left of the Democratic Party. And that scenario seems to me more and more plausible. And I don't think that's not an appetizing prospect
I mean,
at all.
that's genuinely scary.